The dust of Harmony Creek clung to everything, a fine, gritty reminder of the town's unforgiving nature. It coated the wooden planks of the general store, the faded signs of the saloon, and the threadbare dresses of its inhabitants. For Martha Clarke, it was a constant companion, settling on the shoulders of her worn coat and in the creases of her tired face. It had been 6 months since a stray bullet, a mistake in a drunken brawl, had taken her husband, John. 6 months of silent grief and the deafening weight of a poverty she had never known. The world, once a place of modest comfort and shared laughter, had shrunk to the 4 walls of their small cabin and the weary rhythm of day-to-day survival. Martha walked with her head down, her hand tightly holding that of her son, Billy. At 10 years old, he was a mirror of his father, with wide, kind eyes and a mop of sun-bleached hair. He was her reason for living, a constant flickering flame in the darkness. But even he felt the change in the town. The friendly nods had been replaced by cold stares, the warm greetings by whispered insults. John had been a respected carpenter, and his sudden absence left a void the town seemed eager to fill with pity and scorn. They saw Martha not as a woman in mourning, but as a burden, a charity case waiting to happen. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Billy's voice was a soft whisper, barely audible over the wind. He pointed towards the empty space where his father's workshop once stood. The tools had been sold, the wood sold, the last remnants of their former life bartered away for flour and beans. Martha squeezed his hand. "We'll be just fine, sweetheart. We always are." It was a lie she told herself as much as him, a mantra to ward off the encroaching despair. She felt the eyes on her, the judgment in the air. The butcher, Old Man Granger, spat on the ground as they passed. A group of women huddled outside the mill turned their backs. The loneliness was a physical ache. They were on the outskirts of town now, the familiar path home stretching ahead. It was here, in the barren, scrub-filled land that separated Harmony Creek from the vast, indifferent desert, that they found him. Lying in the dust, half hidden by a cluster of sagebrush, was a horse. But this was not a horse of pride and power. He was a skeleton wrapped in skin, his ribs a stark, brutal outline. His coat was matted and caked with mud, his eyes cloudy with sickness and exhaustion. He wasn't moving, save for the shallow, ragged breaths that stirred the dust around his nostrils. Billy pulled on Martha's hand. "Mama, is he dead?" Martha knelt slowly, her heart pounding. The sight of such suffering stirred something deep within her, a raw, protective instinct. It wasn't pity. It was a connection. She saw in the horse's plight her own, abandoned, broken, and struggling to find the will to go on. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers gently touching his neck. The skin was clammy, the muscle gone. But beneath her palm, a weak pulse fluttered. He was alive, just barely. "No, Billy," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce conviction. "He's not. He's trying to hold on." The horse's eyes, dull as they were, seemed to flicker, as if acknowledging her words. A single shuddering sigh escaped him. Billy, sensing his mother's change, knelt beside her. He reached out and stroked the horse's bony head. "Who would do this?" he asked, his voice cracking with a child's pure outrage. Martha had no answer. She knew the kind of man who would abandon a dying animal, a man who saw no value in a life that could not serve him. It was the same kind of cruelty she faced every day. A thought, as wild and desperate as it was beautiful, bloomed in her mind. This horse, this forsaken creature, was a mirror of their own struggle. He was a test, and she would not fail. "Billy," she said, her voice stronger now, "we have to get him home." Billy's eyes widened. "But Mama, we don't have food for us." "I know," she said, her gaze fixed on the horse. "But look at him. He's giving up. And we can't let him. We'll find a way. We have to." She knew the decision was insane. Every logical part of her mind screamed at the folly of it. They could barely feed themselves. What were they thinking, taking on another mouth, another life to save? The cost would be astronomical. It would likely break them completely. But the alternative, leaving the animal to a slow, miserable death, was something she couldn't bear. It felt like a final surrender, a confirmation of everything the town believed about her, that she was weak, that she was lost, And she was not. Not yet. She carefully moved to the horse's other side, trying to find a way to get him to his feet. He was heavy, but his bones were so light. She whispered to him, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Come on, boy. You're not done yet. We're going to get you out of here." The horse didn't move, but a single tear, a mix of dirt and moisture, rolled from his eye and left a clean streak on his dusty cheek. It was enough. It was a sign. A silent plea answered. Billy watched her, his young face etched with worry, but also a burgeoning sense of purpose. He saw the resolve in his mother's eyes, the strength she had been hiding under the grief. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just a horse. It was an act of defiance. It was a refusal to let the darkness win. And in that moment, in the harsh, dusty landscape, a new chapter of their lives began. A chapter where compassion was a currency more valuable than gold, and hope was found in the most unlikely of places. They would feed him, even if it cost them everything. The struggle to get the horse to the cabin was a trial of will and physical exhaustion. The animal was too weak to stand on his own, his legs buckling like dry twigs under the slightest pressure. Martha and Billy had to improvise, using a long piece of fallen branch as a makeshift lever, trying to coax him to his feet. The sun beat down on them, turning the dry air into a furnace. Sweat beaded on Martha's brow, stinging her eyes as she grunted with effort, her muscles screaming in protest. Billy, for his part, was a whirlwind of small, determined energy. He pulled on a tattered piece of rope he had found, whispering encouraging words to the horse, his voice a child's song of comfort. They made slow, agonizing progress. Every foot of ground was a victory. Every failed attempt a setback that threatened to break their spirits. They were just a few hundred yards from the edge of town when the first person saw them. It was Old Man Granger, sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood. He stopped, his knife hovering in midair, and squinted. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he took in the sight of the woman and child wrestling with the dying beast. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet afternoon. "Martha Clarke lost her mind," he called out. "Trying to save a dead horse. That's what grief does to a woman." The sound carried. Soon other faces appeared in doorways and windows. The butcher, the mill owner, the baker's wife. They all emerged to watch the spectacle. A crowd began to form, not out of concern, but out of a morbid curiosity, a desire to see the final downfall of the town's poor widow. Whispers and pointed fingers followed them. "Look at her," a woman said to her neighbor, "starving her own boy for a useless animal. Shameful." "Her husband would be rolling in his grave," another added, loud enough for Martha to hear. The words were like stones, hitting her with a force more painful than the strain in her muscles, but she refused to look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the horse, her mind set on a single goal. She would not let their cruelty win. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Just ignore them, Mama," Billy said, his voice small but resolute. He tightened his grip on the rope, his face flushed with anger and shame on his mother's behalf. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to half-drag, half-coax the horse to the small clearing behind their cabin. Martha sank to her knees, panting, her hands scraped and raw. The horse collapsed to the ground, a heap of bone and fur, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. He looked at them with those tired, knowing eyes. Martha leaned against the cabin wall, her head in her hands, trying to catch her breath. "Billy," she said, her voice hoarse, "we've got to get him some water, and something to eat." Billy nodded. He ran inside and came back with a tin bucket and their last few rations of oats. He poured the oats into the bucket and carried it to the horse. Martha, meanwhile, had managed to fill another bucket with what little water was left in their well. She held it to the horse's mouth. The animal drank with a slow, desperate thirst, his throat working with a dry, clicking sound. As he drank, Martha studied him. The horse was a pinto, but his patches of black and white were so caked with dirt it was hard to tell. His mane was a tangled mess, and his tail was little more than a dirty clump. But as the water seeped into his system, a faint glimmer of life returned to his eyes. He lifted his head slightly, nuzzling Martha's hand as she held the bucket. It was a gesture of immense gratitude, and it was all the payment she needed. "We should give him a name," Billy said. watching the horse with a newfound hope. Martha thought for a moment. He was a fighter, a creature who had clung to life against all odds. He had spirit, even when all seemed lost. Spirit, she said, the name feeling right on her tongue. His name is Spirit. Billy smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in weeks. Spirit, he repeated, stroking the horse's nose. The next few weeks were a blur of sacrifice and struggle. Martha bartered what little was left of her husband's things, a few old shirts, a belt, a half-used spool of thread, to buy horse feed. The money was never enough. She would stand in the general store, the sour-faced owner, Mr. Peterson, watching her with thinly veiled contempt as she chose a small sack of grain over a sack of potatoes for herself and her son. One afternoon, Mr. Peterson leaned over the counter, his voice a low hiss. "Martha, you're a fool. That money could buy you and the boy a decent meal. You're starving yourselves for a broken animal." Martha met his gaze, her chin held high. "I'll feed him even if it costs me," she said, her voice firm. "He's not a broken animal, he's family." Peterson snorted in disgust. "You'll be broke and you'll be buried, mark my words." She left the store, the weight of his words heavy in the air. The truth was, she was terrified. They were eating little more than stale bread and boiled weeds from the fields. Billy was growing thin, and she could feel the hunger pangs in her own stomach, a constant gnawing ache. But when she returned to the cabin and saw Spirit, a little stronger each day, his coat starting to shine with a faint, healthy sheen, she knew she had made the right choice. He was a symbol, a promise, a reason to keep fighting. Their little cabin, once filled with grief, was now filled with a purpose, a quiet resolve that no one in Harmony Creek could understand. The first few weeks of caring for Spirit were a constant battle against futility. He was a canvas of suffering, and Martha's efforts to bring him back to life felt like painting with water on a rock. He would refuse food for days, his thin frame trembling with fever. Billy, in his childish innocence, would spend hours by the horse's side, reading to him from a tattered copy of a book of fables, his soft voice a soothing melody in the quiet desperation of their cabin. He would bring Spirit buckets of water and clean his matted coat with a brush that had once belonged to his father. He believed, with an unshakable faith, that his mother's kindness was a magic potion that would make the horse whole again. Martha was not so naive. She saw the reality of their situation. Every grain of feed they bought was a meal they couldn't afford. She had sold the last of her husband's belongings, the small hand-carved rocking horse he had made for Billy when he was a baby, and even her own wedding ring. The gold band, a symbol of a life that was now gone, had fetched just enough to buy 2 weeks' worth of feed. Mr. Peterson, the general store owner, had given her a pitying look, but the transaction was all business to him. He was not a man of compassion, but of ledgers and accounts. The town's mockery only grew more pointed. When she walked down the dusty main street, she could hear the snippets of conversation. "The widow's gone mad. She's a fool, wasting her life on a dying animal. Just a matter of time before they come and take the land. She'll have nothing left." The last part hit her the hardest. Her small plot of land was all she had left. It was a 1/4 acre with a tiny cabin and a well that was already showing signs of going dry in the early summer heat. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. A local farmer, a big blustering man named Thomas Henderson, had been eyeing the property for months. He had a large, thriving ranch on the adjacent land and wanted to expand. He had already approached her twice, offering a pittance for the land. Martha had refused, but his persistence was a constant low-level threat. He saw her as weak, and her compassionate act with the horse as proof of her irrationality. One afternoon, Billy returned from fetching water, his face pale and tight. "Mama," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "Mr. Henderson was at the well. He said we should sell the land to him now before we lose it all. He said we can't afford to be sentimental." Martha's heart sank. She wrapped her arms around her son, holding him tight. "He's just trying to scare us, Billy. He can't take our home, it's ours, and we won't sell it, not for anything." She said the words with a conviction she hoped she felt, but the truth was, Henderson's words had struck a chord of fear. What if they ran out of money completely? What if she couldn't get another job, couldn't sell anything else? The fear of losing her home was a cold, sharp knife. Despite the fear, Spirit was slowly, miraculously improving. The fever broke, his breathing became more regular, and a spark of life returned to his eyes. He was still incredibly thin, but his ribs were less pronounced, and his matted coat was beginning to shed, revealing a sleek, healthy shine underneath. Martha would spend hours brushing him, the rhythmic motion a kind of therapy for her own frayed nerves. She spoke to him as she would a friend, telling him about her husband, about Billy, and about the struggles she faced. The horse would listen, his head resting gently on her shoulder, a silent, comforting presence. One day Spirit stood for the first time without assistance. Martha and Billy watched in stunned silence as he rose on wobbly legs, his body swaying slightly, before he found his balance. He was taller than they had imagined, with a powerful frame hidden beneath his skeletal appearance. He took a few hesitant steps, then another and another, until he was walking in a small circle, his gait still awkward, but full of a new, burgeoning strength. Billy let out a whoop of joy, running to hug the horse's neck. "He's getting better, Mama. He's really getting better." Billy's face was alight with pure, unadulterated happiness. Martha smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that had been a stranger to her face for months. Tears of relief welled in her eyes. "Yes, he is," she whispered. "He's a fighter." This small victory, this proof that her sacrifices were not in vain, was a powerful motivator. It gave her the strength to face the town's disdain, to endure the hunger pangs, and to stand her ground against the likes of Thomas Henderson. The horse was no longer just an animal she had saved. He was a testament to her resilience. The town could mock her, call her a fool, but they could not deny the life they saw now in Spirit. He was a living symbol of her unwavering faith in kindness, a powerful refutation of their cynicism. And in that moment, as she watched her son and the horse, she felt a glimmer of hope that transcended their current hardships, a promise that good deeds, however costly, could yield a reward far more valuable than money. Elias Thorne arrived in Harmony Creek with the quiet authority of a man who owned the ground he walked on. His presence was a stark contrast to the town's frayed, dusty existence. He wasn't a showy man. He rode a sturdy dark stallion and wore a simple dust-covered coat and a hat that shadowed his face. But there was a quality to him, a kind of coiled power that made people instinctively step aside. His hands, though strong, were not calloused like a ranch hand's. They were the hands of a man who planned, who built, who commanded. He tethered his horse outside the town's small hotel, paid for a room with a handful of clean, crisp bills, and then began to do what he did best: observe. He spent his first few days in town at the saloon, not drinking or carousing, but listening. He sat in a corner, a single glass of whiskey on the table, and absorbed the flow of conversation. He heard about the weather, the price of cattle, the constant squabbles, and he heard with surprising frequency about the crazy widow and her dying horse. The stories were a mixture of mockery and disbelief, tales of a woman's foolishness and a child's naive hope. He heard the name Martha Clarke and the nickname Spirit for the horse. He learned of her husband's death and her struggles. The tone of the townspeople's talk was filled with a mix of pity and disdain, the kind of contempt a person holds for someone who has failed to thrive in their harsh world. Elias wasn't a man given to idle curiosity, but the story intrigued him. He'd seen plenty of people struggle, but rarely with such a public and seemingly self-destructive act of kindness. He finished his drink and left the saloon, his mind already working, piecing together the bits of information he had gathered. He asked the hotel owner about Thomas Henderson. The owner's face soured. "Greedy devil," he muttered. "Owns half the county and wants to buy up the rest, always sniffing around the little people trying to take their land for cheap." This confirmed the whispers Elias had heard. Henderson was a classic vulture, and Martha Clarke was his latest prey. That afternoon, Elias decided to take a walk. He followed the path that led out of town, the same one Martha and Billy had taken. He kept to the shadows of the scattered trees, his tall frame a silent shadow. He saw the small, dilapidated cabin in the distance, and to his surprise a horse standing in the small clearing behind it. It was thin, yes, a bag of bones still, but it was standing. It wasn't lying in the dust, waiting to die. It was a testament to a level of care that defied the town's narrative. He saw Martha from a distance. She was meticulously brushing the horse's coat, a slow, gentle motion that spoke of patience and love. Her back was to him, but he could see the quiet dignity in her posture. Billy was nearby, mending a small fence, his head bent in concentration. The boy moved with a certain maturity, a weariness beyond his years. The scene was one of quiet, resilient purpose. It was not the scene of a family on the verge of ruin. It was a family fighting for their lives and winning. Elias watched for a long time, unseen. He had come to Harmony Creek on business, to find a parcel of land to purchase and expand his ranching empire. The land around Harmony Creek was prime for grazing, and Henderson's holdings were a large part of it. The man was an obstacle, and Elias had a feeling he would be a difficult one. But seeing Martha Clarke and her horse, he felt a shift in his purpose. The transaction was no longer just about land. It was about something more. He saw a woman of immense spirit, a child of remarkable resilience, and an animal that was a symbol of their fight. It was a story told without a single word, and it moved him in a way he hadn't expected. He turned and walked back towards town, the sun casting long shadows behind him. He needed to learn more about the land, more about Henderson, and more about the woman who had defied the cruelty of a whole town. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his time in Harmony Creek was not just about business anymore. It was about something else entirely. It was about righting a wrong, about lending a hand to a person who asked for nothing, and about seeing a fight to its end. He returned to the saloon, his mind no longer on cattle or land prices, but on a widow, a boy, and a horse named Spirit. He had a feeling his arrival in this quiet, dusty town was not a coincidence. It was a purpose. Thomas Henderson was a man who saw weakness and smelled opportunity. He was a large man, with a gut that strained the buttons of his vest and a face that was a perpetual sneer. His hands were thick and calloused, used to grabbing what he wanted, whether it be land or power. He had watched Martha Clarke and her son since the death of her husband, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He'd seen her sell off her belongings, watched her grow thin, and now he saw her wasting what little she had on a worthless horse. To him, it was the perfect storm. Her grief had turned her into a fool, and her foolishness was about to hand him the very land he coveted. He decided to make his move. He rode his horse to her cabin one morning, the dust of his mount's hooves a loud insulting cloud in the quiet air. He dismounted with a huff and strode to her front door. Billy, who was outside fetching water, saw him, and his face immediately tightened with fear. He put the bucket down and ran inside, his small body a protective shield for his mother. Martha opened the door, her face a mask of polite indifference. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Henderson's sneer deepened. "Pleasure? There's no pleasure in seeing a woman ruin herself, Mrs. Clarke. I've come to talk some sense into you. This folly with the horse has gone on long enough. People are talking. It's a disgrace to your husband's memory." Martha's eyes flashed with anger, but she held her tongue. She knew he wasn't there to offer genuine concern. "My husband's memory is my own to protect, Mr. Henderson, and my choices are my own to make." "Your choices are making you destitute," he said, his voice rising in volume. "You're spending your last dime on a sack of bones. That horse won't last the summer. You're a widow and a mother. You need to be thinking about your boy's future, not some worthless animal's." Billy, listening from the shadows of the living room, clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, to tell the man that Spirit was not worthless, that he was getting better, but he stayed silent, a silent witness to his mother's pain and dignity. Henderson leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but loud enough for Billy to hear. "I've offered you a fair price for this land before, Martha. I'll offer it again. You can take the money, go somewhere else, start over. Before you have nothing left, I'm doing you a favor, woman." "I don't need your favors," Martha said, her voice a low, fierce murmur. "And I won't sell. This is my home. It's my son's home, and it's not for sale." Henderson let out a frustrated huff. "You'll regret this. When the well runs dry, and you and the boy are starving, you'll regret it." He turned and stomped back to his horse, the thud of his boots on the dry earth a final, angry exclamation. He mounted his horse and rode away, a cloud of dust trailing behind him like a physical representation of his venomous words. After he left, Martha leaned against the door, her shoulders slumping with a sudden weariness. Billy came to her, his small hand reaching for hers. "He's a bad man, Mama," he whispered. "I know, Billy," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But he can't hurt us, not as long as we have each other." She didn't want him to worry, but she knew the fear was there, a constant companion now. Henderson's threats weren't empty. He was a man who got what he wanted, and he was not above making life difficult for those who stood in his way. The thought of losing the land, their last bastion of hope, was a deep, gnawing fear. Unbeknownst to them, Elias Thorne had been a silent witness to the exchange. He had been riding on the road that paralleled the property, surveying the land, when he saw Henderson's horse tied in front of Martha's cabin. He reined in his horse and watched from a distance, the quiet conversation carrying to his ears on the wind. He saw the way Henderson loomed over the smaller woman, the way his body language was filled with a predatory hunger, and he saw Martha's steadfast refusal, her simple words of defiance. It was a sight that filled him with a quiet admiration. This woman was not a victim. She was a survivor. Elias rode on, his mind working quickly. He had a few business dealings in town that required him to speak to Henderson, and now he had a new card to play. He knew the man's weakness. It was greed, and he knew how to exploit it. He would use Henderson's desire to get Martha's land against him without ever letting on that he had a personal interest in the matter. He would play a long game, a careful, deliberate game of chess. Because in his world, you didn't just win. You won with purpose, and you protected the innocent from the vultures. And Martha Clarke, the poor widow with a dying horse, was now under his quiet, powerful protection. The day the horse showed his true spirit was a day of profound revelation for Martha and Billy. They had been nurturing him for weeks, and the slow, agonizing progress was often frustrating. But on this particular morning, as Martha carried a bucket of fresh water to his makeshift enclosure, she saw a sight that took her breath away. Spirit was no longer a bag of bones. He was a creature of a new, burgeoning strength. He stood tall and proud, his head held high and his eyes, once dull and lifeless, now held a deep, intelligent fire. His coat, meticulously brushed by Billy, was beginning to shine with health, revealing the striking pinto markings. The black patches were a deep, glossy obsidian, and the white was a clean, pure ivory. He was a magnificent animal, built for speed and power, a stark contrast to the sickly beast they had found by the roadside. He looked at Martha, and she saw in his gaze a profound sense of gratitude. He let out a low, rumbling whinny, a sound of greeting and a sound of thanks. Billy came running, his face alight with wonder. "Mama, look, he's beautiful." Martha knelt, her hand outstretched. Spirit came to her, his nose nudging her palm. It was an unspoken conversation, a moment of deep connection. She had poured her grief, her hope, and her limited resources into this animal, and he was giving her back a piece of her soul. He was a testament to her faith, a living, breathing proof that kindness could triumph over despair. Billy, overcome with excitement, ran his hands along the horse's neck. "He's not a skeleton anymore. He's a real horse." "He always was, Billy," Martha said, tears welling in her eyes. "He was just waiting for us to see it." This moment of triumph was fleeting, however. The reality of their situation had a cruel way of intruding. As Martha stood there, marveling at the horse, she felt a sharp pang of hunger. The last of their flour was gone. They had no sugar, no salt, and only a few beans left. The feed for Spirit was also running dangerously low. The money from her wedding ring was all but spent. The victory was sweet, but the cost was becoming unbearable. "We need to go to town," she said to Billy, her voice filled with a fresh wave of dread. "We have to find something. Anything." Billy's excitement faded, replaced by a familiar look of worry. "What are we going to do, Mama? There's nothing left to sell." Martha didn't have an answer. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders once again. Spirit's recovery was a miracle, but it couldn't be sustained on hope alone. He needed proper feed, and they needed food for themselves. The town that had so cruelly watched their struggle was now their only source of aid, and they had proven themselves to be anything but charitable. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne, who had been observing Martha's cabin from a hidden vantage point, saw the horse for the first time. He had heard the rumors, heard the descriptions of a dying animal. But the horse he saw now was a different creature entirely. He was a magnificent pinto, his posture proud, his movement strong and purposeful. The change was stunning. It spoke volumes about the woman who had brought him back from the brink. Elias, a horseman himself, was a keen judge of a good animal. He could see the bloodlines, the potential, the sheer grace of the beast. This was no ordinary horse. It was an exceptional one, a horse with a powerful frame and an even more powerful spirit. He realized then that the horse was not the charity case the town saw. He was a valuable asset, an investment of love and labor that was about to pay off in an unexpected way. The sight of Martha and Billy's quiet joy, followed by the sight of Martha's renewed worry, cemented his decision. He had to help her, not out of pity but out of a deep respect for her strength and her conviction. He saw a woman who had taken on the world for a creature she barely knew and had won. She was the kind of person you wanted on your side. He made a mental note of her immediate needs and began to formulate a plan. He would not just buy her land to spite Henderson. He would find a way to help her on her own terms, to give her the means to thrive on her own. He rode back to town, a man with a new purpose. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a quiet force for good and a protector of the resilient. The walk into Harmony Creek was a gauntlet of silent judgment. Martha pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, not against the chill but against the stares. She was a ghost in her own town, an object of pity and gossip. She had one last, desperate errand, to talk to the stable master, a gruff but fair man, to see if there was any work she could do, a few odd jobs in exchange for feed for spirit. She found him in the dusty stable, mending a saddle. He looked up, his expression softening slightly as he saw her. "Martha," he said, "I heard about the horse. A foolish thing, but you've got a good heart." "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice low, "I need work, anything, cleaning stalls, mending harnesses, anything you'll have me do. I need to buy feed." Callahan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm sorry, Martha. Business is slow. I can't afford to pay anyone right now, not even for odd jobs. And I'm not a charity, you understand?" A cold despair settled over her. She nodded, understanding perfectly. She was a charity case in their eyes, and no one wanted to be associated with that. "I understand," she whispered, and turned to leave, her shoulders slumping in defeat. As she stepped out of the stable and into the main street, she nearly collided with a tall man wearing a dark, well-made coat and a serious expression. It was Elias Thorne. He had seen her talking to Callahan, and he had heard the stablemaster's brusque refusal. He caught her arm, not in a grasp, but in a gentle, steadying touch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, "my apologies." Martha pulled back, her heart pounding. She had seen him around town, had heard the hushed whispers about the rich rancher who had come to buy land. He was a man of power, of a world so far removed from her own. "It's all right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were direct and unnervingly perceptive. He saw the weariness in her face, the desperation in her eyes, and the quiet dignity that she carried like a shield. "I overheard," he said, his voice quiet. "You need work." It was not a question, but a simple statement of fact. Martha's face flushed with a mixture of shame and pride. "I manage," she said, refusing to beg. Elias nodded slowly. "I'm looking to buy some supplies. I could use a hand carrying things back to my hotel room." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. He was a man who could command a team of men with a single word. He didn't need a poor widow to carry his bags. Martha was suspicious. Was this a test? A trick? But his eyes were honest, and his face was impassive. There was no pity there, only a quiet offer of help. She hesitated, her mind racing. The thought of a few dollars, enough to buy a small bag of feed, was too tempting to refuse. "I can do that," she said, her voice stronger now. He led her to the general store, where he bought a large sack of grain and a smaller one of oats. He also bought a thick leather saddle and a variety of other supplies, far more than one man could carry. He paid Peterson with a thick stack of bills, not a word wasted. Peterson, for his part, was all smiles and servitude, a stark contrast to the contempt he showed Martha. "Here," Elias said, handing her the sack of oats, "for your trouble." He didn't say, "for the horse." He didn't need to. He simply handed her the money for the work, a generous amount, and then turned to carry the rest of the supplies himself. Martha stood there, dumbfounded, the weight of the sack of oats and the money in her hand. It was more than a few days' wages for the kind of work she was asking for. It was a lifeline. She didn't know why he had done it, why a man of his stature would show a simple act of kindness, but she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She looked at his retreating back, a tall, silent figure walking towards the hotel, and felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in months. He had seen her not as a charity case, but as a person, and that, in itself, was a powerful gift. The summer heat, a constant companion in Harmony Creek, intensified. The sky turned a blinding white, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury. The grass, already sparse, withered to a brittle brown, and the river that ran through the valley slowed to a trickle. The town was gripped by a drought, and the mood, already somber, turned desperate. Water became the new currency. The town well, their main source of water, began to dry up, its depth receding by the day. Lines formed at dawn, people with buckets and barrels, their faces etched with anxiety. The townspeople, already on edge, grew more irritable, more suspicious of one another. The well at Martha's cabin, which had been a shallow but reliable source, now gave up only a few precious drops a day. The ground around it was cracked and dry, like an old woman's skin. The drought compounded their problems tenfold. Martha had managed to buy a few supplies with the money from Elias Thorne, enough to give Spirit a fighting chance and to put some decent food in Billy's belly. But the future was an unknown, a bleak, thirsty landscape. Spirit was recovering, but he needed a steady supply of water to truly regain his strength. Martha found herself making multiple trips to the town well, only to find the line long and the water scarce. One afternoon, as she stood in line, Thomas Henderson approached her. He had a smug look on his face, the kind of look a man has when he knows he's about to win. "See, Martha," he said, his voice a low, oily whisper. "I told you. The good Lord himself is telling you to give up. This land is worthless without water. Your well's probably bone dry by now, isn't it?" Martha refused to meet his gaze. She focused on the bucket in her hands, her knuckles white from her tight grip. "Now, listen to me," he continued, a fake kindness in his tone. "I've got a deep well on my land. I'm building a new water trough. I could give you a place to work, you and the boy. You could come live on my ranch. All you have to do is sign over your land. A fair exchange. Before you're left with nothing but a thirsty horse and an empty stomach." "I told you before, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice strained but firm. "My home is not for sale." He let out a short, frustrated laugh. "You're a stubborn woman, Martha. You'll die on this hill and you'll drag that boy with you." He walked away, his words a venomous trail in the air. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne, using his vast resources, had begun to secure his own water supply. He had hired a team of men to dig a deep well on a small parcel of land he had recently purchased on the outskirts of town. He also had a small caravan of water wagons brought in from a distant town, ensuring that his own cattle and ranch hands would not suffer. His actions were a mix of shrewd business and subtle benevolence. He did not hoard the water. He sold it at a fair price to anyone who could afford it, his a stark contrast to the local men who were already trying to price gouge their neighbors. He was a force of quiet competence in a town of desperate men. From his hotel room, Elias watched the townspeople line up at the well, their faces grim. He knew the situation was critical. Henderson was using the drought as a weapon, and Martha Clarke was his primary target. The woman was running out of time, and he needed to act quickly. He couldn't just give her water. That would make her a charity case again. And he had seen the pride in her eyes. He needed to find a way to help her that was both practical and dignified, a way that would allow her to keep her independence and her land. He knew what his next step had to be. He had to go to her, to talk to her face to face, and to make an offer that she couldn't refuse. An offer that would not be about money or charity, but about a partnership, a solution that would benefit them both and leave Henderson with nothing but his own bitter greed. The morning after Henderson's veiled threat at the well, Martha was at her wit's end. The well behind her cabin was now completely dry. Spirit, though stronger, was becoming restless with thirst. Billy sat quietly in a corner, his face pale with worry. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the low rumble of Spirit's discomfort outside. Martha knew she had no choice. She had to go back to the town well, join the line, and face the shame and the jeers of the townspeople. It was then that she heard the sound of a horse approaching, a single heavy thud of hooves on the dry ground. She walked to the window and saw him. Elias Thorne, astride his powerful black stallion, was dismounting in front of her cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest. The feeling was a mix of apprehension and a strange, unfamiliar hope. He strode to her door and knocked, the sound loud and purposeful. Martha opened it, her hand gripping the worn wood. Billy stood behind her, a small, protective shadow. "Mrs. Clarke," Elias said, his voice calm and direct. There was no small talk, no feigned pleasantries. He got right to the point. "I know who you are. I know about your struggles. I also know about Thomas Henderson's intentions. He wants this land, and he will stop at nothing to get it." Martha's guard went up instantly. "I don't know what you've heard, sir, but my land is not for sale. I will not sell it." Elias held up a hand. "I'm not here to buy it. I'm here to offer a proposition." He gestured towards the pasture behind the cabin where Spirit stood, his head drooping slightly in the heat. "That's a fine animal you've saved. He has good bloodlines. He's a powerful horse with a good frame. He's worth more than you know." Martha felt a flicker of surprise. He saw the truth of the horse, not the town's mockery. "I have a large ranch outside of town," he continued. "I need good horses. I'm willing to buy the horse from you, for a fair price." Martha felt a sharp pang of pain. Sell Spirit? The thought was unbearable. "No," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't. He's family." Elias nodded, as if he expected the answer. "I understand. But he's getting strong. A horse like that, he needs to run. He needs room to live. He needs a life of purpose. You can't give him that here. He'll just be a pretty face in a small pen. You saved his life, but his purpose is out there, on a ranch." His words struck a chord of truth. She knew he was right. Spirit was a creature of the open range, and she was keeping him in a small, arid plot of land. She had saved his life, but could she give him a life worth living? What would you pay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias named a sum that was so large, so far beyond anything she had ever imagined, it made her gasp. It was enough to buy a new piece of land, a small house in a town somewhere else. It was enough to live on for years, to give Billy a future. "I can't," she said, shaking her head, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I can't sell him." "Then let's not call it a sale," Elias said, a faint smile on his lips. "Let's call it a partnership. I'll buy a quarter share of the horse from you for that price. He stays here, he'll be yours, but he'll also work for me. And in return, I'll pay you a monthly stipend, and I'll see to it that you have enough feed and water for him and for yourselves, as long as he works for me." Martha looked at him, her mind reeling. It was not charity. It was a business deal, a partnership. It was a way to save her home, to feed her son, and to keep the horse she had saved. It was a way to fight back against Henderson without having to surrender her land. "What's in it for you?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "I want a good horse," he said simply, "and I want to see a good deed rewarded. That's all." His eyes were unreadable, but his words were genuine. She looked at her son, then at Spirit. The horse raised his head, as if he knew what was at stake. She had saved his life, and now he was offering to save hers. It was a strange, beautiful circle of fate. She had trusted her instincts when she found him on the road. Now she had to trust them again. She held out her hand, a small, tired hand against his large, powerful one. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength, "you have a deal." The first few days after the deal with Elias Thorne were a quiet revolution in Martha Clarke's life. The steady flow of necessities, once a luxury, was now a dependable rhythm. A wagon arrived from Thorne's ranch, not with fanfare, but with a simple delivery of stacked hay, sacks of grain, and a barrel of fresh, cool water. The men who delivered it were quiet and respectful, placing everything exactly where it was needed, their movements efficient and professional. They did not linger, did not ask questions, and did not make a single comment about the widow and her horse. This simple, dignified transaction was a stark contrast to the small-minded cruelty Martha had become accustomed to. For Billy, the change was immediate and profound. His face, once pale with worry, began to fill out. The dark circles under his eyes faded, replaced by the bright, inquisitive gaze of a healthy boy. He ate with an appetite Martha had not seen in months, and his laughter, a sound she had feared she would never hear again, returned to the small cabin. He spent hours with Spirit, brushing his coat until it gleamed, talking to him as if he were a friend. The horse, too, seemed to sense the change. His coat, a healthy black and white, was now thick and glossy. His movements were no longer tentative, but confident and powerful. He would nuzzle Billy's hand, his soft breath a warm comfort against the boy's skin. The town, however, was a different story. The whispers didn't stop. They merely changed their tune. The mockery was replaced by a tense, resentful curiosity. People watched from behind their curtains as Thorne's wagons came and went. The sight of the poor widow thriving, of her land no longer a symbol of ruin, was an affront to their cynical view of the world. They couldn't understand it. Some murmured that Thorne must have some nefarious purpose, a hidden clause in their deal that would see him steal the land in the end. Others were simply jealous, their own struggles made more bitter by the sight of Martha's quiet prosperity. The biggest shift came in the confrontation between Elias and Thomas Henderson. Elias, in his customary quiet way, had made an appointment to meet with Henderson at the saloon, a public place where their conversation would be heard. Henderson, confident and smug, saw it as a chance to belittle the newcomer. "So, Thorne," Henderson said, his voice a low sneer, "I hear you've taken to bailing out the town's charity cases. Got a soft spot for strays, do you?" Elias took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I'm a rancher, Henderson. I recognize a good investment when I see one, and that horse is a better investment than most of the cattle you're trying to pass off as prime stock." Henderson's face flushed with anger. "That horse is a broken beast, and that woman is a fool." "I think you'll find," Elias said, his voice never rising above a calm, even tone, "that both of them have more spirit than this entire town. And as for the land, I'm glad to see it's no longer for sale. It would be a shame to see it fall into the hands of a man who only sees profit, not potential." The men at the bar went silent. They knew Henderson's reputation, and they had never seen anyone stand up to him so calmly, so completely. Henderson sputtered, his face a mottled red. He had been outmaneuvered, his own words and actions used against him. He slammed his glass down and stormed out, leaving a tense, charged silence in his wake. Elias finished his drink, paid his tab, and left without another word, his departure as quiet and impactful as his arrival. The town had seen a new kind of power, one that didn't rely on bluster or cruelty, but on quiet strength and intelligence. A few days later, Elias came to the cabin, not with a delivery, but to speak with Martha. He sat on a small stool while she sat on the porch step, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them. "The town's talking," he said, stating the obvious. "They'll always find something to talk about," Martha replied. "They won't understand what we're doing," he said. "They'll see it as charity. They'll see it as me taking advantage of you. You have to be ready for that." "I've been ready for that my whole life," she said, a dry bitterness in her voice. "They've had me pegged as a fool since the day John died." "You're not a fool, Martha," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You're the only one in this town with the courage to do what's right. That's not foolishness, it's strength." The compliment, so simple and sincere, caught her off guard. She looked at him, at his serious face and his steady eyes. "Why did you really do it, Mr. Thorne? Why a partnership instead of just a purchase? He looked at her then to Spirit, who was grazing in the small pasture, his movements fluid and graceful. "Because I saw what you did for him," he said. "You saw past his suffering. You saw the spirit within him. I'm a man who builds things, Mrs. Clarke. And I saw something in you too, something strong and worth building on. I saw a partnership, not a transaction. I saw a future, not just a way to make a buck." His words settled in her heart like a warm balm. He wasn't just a rich rancher. He was a man who understood a different kind of value. He saw dignity, not pity. He saw potential, not poverty. In that quiet moment, sitting on her porch with the dust settling around them, a new foundation was laid, not of wood and stone, but of trust and mutual respect. She felt for the first time since her husband's death that she was not alone in her fight. The days that followed fell into a new, comfortable routine. Elias Thorne began to make regular visits to the cabin. He would arrive in the early morning, before the sun had a chance to bake the land, and would spend hours working with Spirit. He was a natural horseman, his movements with the animal precise and patient. He had a way of communicating with Spirit that didn't involve commands but a quiet understanding. He worked with him on a long lunge line, teaching him to respond to subtle shifts in his weight and voice. Billy was Elias's constant shadow. He watched with wide-eyed fascination as the rancher worked. Elias, for his part, was a patient teacher. He didn't just work on the horse, he worked with the boy. He showed Billy how to hold the reins, how to keep a steady hand, and how to read Spirit's moods. He taught him the importance of a good horse's character, of its spirit, and of the bond between horse and rider. Billy, who had been starved for a positive male role model since his father's death, absorbed every lesson like a sponge. One afternoon, Elias handed Billy the lunge line. "Your turn," he said simply. Billy's hands trembled with excitement as he took the rope. He emulated Elias's movements, his voice a soft echo of the rancher's commands. Spirit, with a patience that belied his powerful frame, followed the boy's lead, trotting in a perfect circle around him. Martha watched from the porch, a lump forming in her throat. She saw not just a boy and a man, but a legacy being passed down. Elias was not only teaching Billy about horses, but about responsibility and trust. The town, of course, was an ever-present audience. They saw the wealthy rancher teaching the poor widow's son. They saw the magnificent pinto, once a symbol of Martha's foolishness, now a testament to her vision. The initial suspicion of Elias was slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. He wasn't a flamboyant man. He was a man of his word, a man who worked hard, and a man who seemed to see things others didn't. The whispers about him being a swindler became a thing of the past. The new gossip was about how well he was training the horse and how well he was treating Martha and Billy. Thomas Henderson, however, was not one of the converted. He was seething. He watched from his ranch, his eyes narrowed, as the unlikely trio worked together. He had been so close to getting that land. He had planned to use the drought to his advantage, to choke Martha out of her property. But Elias Thorne had appeared out of nowhere, a quiet, immovable force. The town's change of heart towards Martha was a direct result of Thorne's intervention, and Henderson saw it as a personal insult. He had always ruled by intimidation and fear, but Thorne was a man who could not be intimidated. His wealth was too vast, his influence too great. Henderson began to spread new, more insidious rumors. He would corner men at the saloon and whisper that Thorne was a gambler, that he had cheated his way to wealth. He'd suggest that Thorne's interest in Martha was not a business deal, but something more sinister, something that would lead to her and her son's ruin. He played on the small town's deep-seated distrust of outsiders and of change, but the words didn't have the same power they once did. People had seen Thorne's work with their own eyes. They had seen the man who spoke little and did much. One hot afternoon, as Elias was working with Spirit, a local farmer rode up. He was a man who had been one of the first to mock Martha. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, that's a mighty fine horse. I've never seen a horse come back from the brink like that. And well, I was wrong about Mrs. Clarke. She's a good woman." Elias nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "She is," he said simply. The man shifted uncomfortably, "I'm sorry for how we acted," he said, a note of genuine remorse in his voice. "We should have helped her." "A little kindness goes a long way," Elias said. "Something this town might have forgotten." The farmer rode away, his head down, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders. Elias turned back to Spirit and Billy, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He wasn't just training a horse. He was teaching a lesson to a town, a lesson about the true cost of kindness and the true price of compassion. He was showing them that a good heart, no matter how poor, was a better investment than all the land and wealth in the world. Thomas Henderson's anger was a storm waiting to break. He had watched from the shadows of his sprawling ranch as Elias Thorne, the quiet interloper, systematically dismantled his plans. Thorne's partnership with Martha Clarke was not just an inconvenience, it was a public humiliation. Henderson had staked his reputation on his ability to get what he wanted, and a poor widow had stood in his way, backed by a man who seemed to have limitless resources and an unnerving lack of fear. The whispers in town, once a source of amusement, now gnawed at his pride. The townspeople were beginning to look at him not with respect, but with a growing contempt, a direct result of Thorne's subtle yet powerful influence. He needed to strike back, and he needed to do it in a way that would remind everyone in Harmony Creek exactly who held the real power. He couldn't go after Thorne directly. A man like that was too insulated, but Martha Clarke was still vulnerable. Her strength came from Thorne's support, and if he could sever that lifeline, she would be just as isolated and desperate as before. He would not just defeat her, he would break her, and in doing so, send a clear message to Elias Thorne and the rest of the town. Henderson began to orchestrate a new campaign of malice. He found his most loyal and most desperate ranch hands and offered them a bonus for a simple job. "I want you to make that widow's life a little harder," he said, a cruel glint in his eye. "She thinks she's safe with her rich friend. I'll show her she's not. I want you to go to her pasture one night and cut the fence. Nothing too obvious. Just a few strands, enough to let that precious horse of hers wander out." His plan was simple but effective. If Spirit ran off, Martha would be in a frantic state, and Thorne would have to spend days searching for him, a wild goose chase that would make him look foolish. It would be a blow to Thorne's pride and a way to re-establish his own dominance. The night after the fence was cut, a new rumor started in town. It was whispered in the saloon and at the general store. "Thorne's not as smart as he thinks. He can't even keep a fence mended. He's just another city slicker who doesn't understand the land." The plan worked for a moment. Martha woke the next morning to the panicked whinny of Spirit. She rushed outside and saw the broken fence, a gaping hole where the wire had been cleanly cut. Her heart sank. Spirit was outside the small pasture, but he hadn't run far. He was grazing near the cabin, a testament to his bond with her and his trust in his new home. But the fear had a cold, sharp edge. It was a clear act of malice, a direct attack. She didn't know who had done it, but she knew why. This was Henderson's way of saying that he was still in control. She felt a profound sense of helplessness. Thorne's generosity had given her a brief respite, but the darkness of the town was still very real. Billy was devastated. He saw the fence and felt the sharp return of the fear that had plagued him for months. "Mama," he whispered, "is this going to keep happening?" Martha didn't have an answer. She tried to mend the fence herself, but her hands were clumsy with the wire cutters, and the work was too hard. She was a woman, not a ranch hand. Her strength was in her spirit, but she lacked the physical fortitude to fight a man like Henderson on his own terms. When Elias Thorne arrived later that morning, he saw the fence immediately. His expression, usually unreadable, was now tight with a quiet fury. He walked over to the cut wire, examining the clean cut, the deliberate way it had been done. He knew it was no accident. "Henderson," he said, the name a low, controlled growl. He did not accuse Henderson openly. Instead, he went to work. He didn't just mend the fence, he reinforced it, bringing a thicker gauge wire and new fence posts. He worked silently, his movements precise and angry. He worked with a speed that spoke of a deep-seated frustration. He was a man of logic and reason, and Henderson's petty, cruel actions were an affront to everything he believed in. He finished the fence and then turned to Martha. "This won't be the end of it," he said, his voice flat. "He'll try again. He's not a man who gives up." Martha nodded, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I know," she said. "I can't live like this, Mr. Thorne. I can't live in fear." Elias looked at her, then at Billy, then at Spirit. He saw the despair, the exhaustion, the quiet dread that had returned to their lives. He knew he had to do more than just mend a fence. He had to put an end to Henderson's malice for good. He had to expose the man for the snake he was, in a way that would be so public and so complete that Henderson would never be a threat again. It was a dangerous move, one that could backfire and make him a target, but he was a man who had faced down far greater threats in his life. He was not afraid of a common bully. He looked at Martha and he saw a promise he had made, a silent vow to protect her and her son, and he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. A week after the fence was mended, Elias Thorne made a proposal. He rode up to the cabin early one morning, a sense of quiet purpose about him. "Martha," he said as she came to the door, "I have a big herd of cattle I'm moving to the north pasture. The men could use a hand. It's a long day's ride, but it would be a good chance for Spirit to stretch his legs. Billy could ride him. It's time for him to work." Martha hesitated, a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never been to Elias's ranch. She knew it was large, but she didn't know the scale. And taking Billy so far from home felt like a risk. But she saw the look on Billy's face. His eyes were shining with a boy's adventurous spirit. He had been longing for a real job, for a sense of purpose. And she knew Elias was right. Spirit was ready to work. It was time for him to become the horse he was meant to be. "We'll come," she said, her voice firm. They arrived at Thorne's ranch an hour later, and the sight was breathtaking. The land stretched out as far as the eye could see, a vast rolling prairie dotted with thousands of cattle. The main ranch house was a large, sturdy structure, with a barn and stables that were bigger than anything Martha had ever seen. The air was filled with the lowing of cattle and the scent of leather and dust. Thorne's ranch hands, men of few words but capable hands, nodded in greeting. They had heard about the widow and her horse and watched with a quiet curiosity. Elias had a special saddle waiting for Spirit, a beautiful, well-worn leather piece that looked custom-made. Billy, with Elias's help, carefully saddled Spirit, his hands surprisingly steady. He mounted the horse, a little wobbly at first, but with a proud confidence. Spirit, in turn, seemed to understand. He was no longer a half-starved beast, but a working horse, a partner to the boy on his back. The day was long, and the work was hard. Martha, surprisingly, found her own sense of purpose. She helped the ranch hands with a variety of tasks, learning to mend a fence with a quick, efficient hand, to tie a knot that held fast, to herd cattle with a patient, firm approach. She was strong, and the physical labor, though exhausting, felt good. It was a different kind of strength than the one she had needed to survive. This was the strength of purpose, of contribution. She was not just a widow struggling to survive, she was a woman working. Billy, meanwhile, was in his element. He rode Spirit with a natural ease, and the horse, sensing his rider's trust, moved with a grace and power that was incredible to witness. He would gallop across the open prairie, rounding up stray cattle, his movements fluid and beautiful. He was no longer just a pet. He was a working animal, a testament to what a little kindness and faith could achieve. During a break for lunch, Martha and Elias sat on the porch of the ranch house, sharing a simple meal of stew and bread. They talked about the land, the weather, and the hard work of ranching. Elias asked her about her life before John's death, about their hopes and dreams. Martha found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone else. She told him about John's kindness, about his dreams of having a family ranch of their own one day. Elias listened, his eyes a steady, calming presence. He spoke of his own life, of his years on the road, of the hard work it took to build his empire. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, they held a quiet wisdom. He spoke of the importance of community, of finding a home, of building a legacy for those who came after you. "You're not so different from John, you know," Martha said, a smile on her face. "He had a quiet way about him, too. He believed in doing things right, not for the show of it." Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe so," he said, a quiet warmth in his eyes. He didn't say anything more, but Martha knew that a different kind of deal had been struck that day, a silent understanding that was deeper than any business proposition. She saw not just a rich rancher, but a man who understood her, a man who saw her for who she truly was. And in the vast open land of his ranch, she felt for the first time in a long time a sense of belonging, a feeling of being at home. The drought, once a slow-moving threat, was now a harsh, undeniable reality. The sky was a pale, cloudless expanse, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury. The wind, once a gentle breeze, was now a dry, hot breath that stirred the dust in a perpetual, suffocating cloud. Water was rationed, and every green blade of grass had long since turned to dust. The ranching community was on edge, their fortunes hanging in the balance. It was in this atmosphere of heightened anxiety that the next blow was dealt. Martha, with her newfound prosperity, had been a target of jealousy and resentment. Elias had provided her with a large stack of hay, enough to last her through the worst of the drought. It was a symbol of her resilience, a physical manifestation of her good fortune. One morning, as Martha went to feed Spirit, her heart sank. The large stack of hay, which had been neatly arranged behind the cabin, was gone. Not a single bale remained. The only evidence of its existence was the scattered dust and the drag marks on the dry ground, leading off in the direction of Henderson's ranch. A cold, sick feeling of dread settled in her stomach. It was a bold, brazen act. It wasn't just a petty theft. It was a deliberate, malicious attack. It was a direct message from Henderson, a sign that her good fortune was an illusion, and that he could take it away from her whenever he wanted. She felt the familiar sting of helplessness, the same feeling that had plagued her after her husband's death. She had thought she was safe. She had thought she had a protector. But the reality of Harmony Creek was that the strong preyed on the weak, and she had just been reminded of it in the cruelest way. Billy, seeing his mother's distraught expression, ran outside. He saw the empty space where the hay had been, and his face fell. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They took it all." He looked at her, his eyes filled with the same fear that had been there months ago before Elias had arrived. His hope, so carefully nurtured, seemed to shrivel in the hot, dry air. Martha knelt and hugged him, her own heart breaking. "It's all right, Billy. We'll find a way." But even as she said the words, she felt a profound sense of defeat. This wasn't just about hay. It was about her dignity. It was about her family. And it was about a man who would stop at nothing to ruin her. When Elias Thorne arrived later that morning, he saw the empty space and the drag marks on the ground. His face, usually a mask of calm, was tight with anger. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the tracks, his eyes scanning the ground with a hunter's precision. He knelt and examined them. The tracks were distinct, the work of a large wagon, and the imprints of the wheels were of a unique make. He knew those tracks. He had seen them on Henderson's property. He stood up, his gaze meeting Martha's. He saw the defeat in her eyes, the devastation on Billy's face. He knew that this was more than just a theft. It was a psychological attack, a way to break her spirit. He had to act, and he had to do so in a way that was not just about getting the hay back, but about putting an end to Henderson's malice for good. He walked over to Spirit, who was standing quietly in the small pasture, his head drooping in the heat. Elias stroked his neck, his touch a silent promise. He looked at Martha and Billy, their faces etched with a profound sense of loss. "Don't worry," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We'll get it back, and we'll make sure he never does something like this again." Martha looked at him, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. "How?" she asked. "We don't have proof. He'll just deny it." "He'll deny it to you," Elias said, a cold, hard glint in his eyes. "But he won't deny it to the whole town, not after I'm through with him. He was a man of action, not of words. He was a man who understood that a public humiliation was a more powerful tool than a simple accusation. He would not just win the battle for the hay. He would win the war for Harmony Creek, and he would do it in a way that would leave Thomas Henderson with nothing but his own bitter, ruined pride." Elias Thorne did not waste a single moment. He was a man of precise movements and calculated actions. He did not go to Henderson's ranch to confront him. He knew such a move would be pointless, and Henderson would simply deny everything, leaving Elias with no evidence and a public argument. Instead, Elias began a quiet investigation, using his resources and his natural sense of observation to gather the proof he needed. He started with the drag marks leading away from Martha's cabin. He followed them on horseback for miles, his gaze fixed on the ground. The tracks were distinct, the imprint of a heavy wagon with a unique tread pattern. He knew that the ranch hands who had delivered the hay to Martha's cabin had used a wagon from his own stock, a wagon with a very different tread. The tracks were a clear, undeniable piece of evidence. He followed them all the way to a small hidden barn on the far side of Henderson's property, a barn that was not part of the main ranching operation. He dismounted and looked inside. The barn was full of hay, but the hay was of a different quality than the one Henderson typically sold. It was the same hay that Elias had delivered to Martha. The proof was right there. But Elias knew he needed more. He needed witnesses. He needed people who would be willing to speak the truth, even against a powerful man like Henderson. He rode into town and began to talk to the men who had been at the saloon on the night of the theft. He spoke to the stable master, Mr. Callahan, who had heard Henderson's men bragging about a job they had done. He spoke to a young ranch hand, a boy who worked for Henderson, who had been tasked with moving the hay in the dead of night. Elias was not threatening. He was calm and direct, his voice low and reassuring. He didn't ask them to lie, he simply asked them to tell the truth. He offered them no money, only the promise of a better life, a life free from the tyranny of Thomas Henderson. He found that the town, though it had once been a source of cruelty for Martha, was now filled with a quiet resentment towards Henderson. The man had a long history of preying on the weak, of taking advantage of the desperate. He had cheated men out of their land, had threatened them, had lied to them. He was a powerful man, but he was also a lonely one, despised by everyone he had ever wronged. Thorne, with his simple act of kindness, had not just helped Martha. He had given the town a new hope, a new way of seeing their own struggles. They saw in Martha's quiet fight a reflection of their own, and now they were willing to speak up. Martha, meanwhile, was struggling. The shock of the theft had left her feeling vulnerable and exposed. She had to use the last of her money to buy a few bales of hay from a farmer she barely knew, a farmer who looked at her with pity and suspicion. But her faith in Elias was unwavering. He had promised to help her, and she believed him. She had seen his quiet strength, his unwavering determination. She knew he would not let this go. She spent her days tending to Spirit, who was still in need of a steady diet of hay and grain. She worked in silence, her mind on the missing hay, on the injustice of it all. But her spirit, though bruised, was not broken. She was a survivor, and she had learned that in this world a woman could not afford to be weak. She had to fight for what was hers. When Elias came to her a few days later, he had a confident look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but she knew. He had found his proof. He had found a way to fight back. He had not just found the hay, he had found the truth. And he was about to unleash it on the entire town. It would not be a quiet, private victory. It would be a public spectacle, a lesson for all of Harmony Creek to see. And for the first time in a long time, Martha felt a sense of vindication, a feeling of hope that was as powerful as the sun. The word spread through Harmony Creek like wildfire. Elias Thorne, the rich rancher, was holding a town meeting. The reason was vague, a discussion about drought relief and community resources. But everyone knew the real reason. This was about the stolen hay. This was about Thomas Henderson. The air was thick with anticipation. It was a showdown everyone had been waiting for, a clash of two powerful men, one who ruled with fear and the other with respect. The meeting was held in the town square, a dusty, open space that was usually reserved for holiday festivals. People came from all over, men and women alike, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Henderson arrived late, a smug smile on his face, his gaze fixed on Elias with a mocking air of superiority. He was confident. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble. He was a master of manipulation and deceit. He believed that he held all the cards. Elias, dressed in a simple, clean shirt, stood in the center of the square, his posture relaxed but authoritative. He did not raise his voice. He did not speak of vengeance or justice. He spoke of community. He spoke of the drought, of the need for everyone to work together. He spoke of the importance of honesty and trust. His words were simple, but they carried a powerful weight. "We all know the drought is hurting us," he said, his voice clear and calm. "But a drought of water is one thing, a drought of character is another." His gaze swept over the crowd, finally resting on Henderson. "Some of us, in our desperation, have been tempted to take what is not ours, to prey on the weak, to use a family's misfortune for our own gain." Henderson bristled, his face turning red. "What are you getting at, Thorne? You got some kind of accusation to make?" He spat. "I have proof," Elias said, his voice never changing. "Proof that a large supply of hay was stolen from a woman and a boy who have been struggling to survive. Hay that I delivered, hay that was meant to feed a horse that she saved, and I have proof of where it went." A murmur went through the crowd. Henderson's smug smile vanished. "That's a lie," he shouted. "I've done nothing of the sort." "I have the tracks, Mr. Henderson," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "Tracks that lead from Mrs. Clarke's property directly to a barn on your land, a barn that you never use." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And I have witnesses, men who were with you when you orchestrated the theft." The crowd turned its attention to Henderson, their faces a mix of shock and anger. Henderson's face was a mask of furious desperation. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "I'm not the only one," a man in the crowd, a small, timid farmer, said, his voice trembling but firm. "He tried to take my land last year, said he'd burn my crops if I didn't sell." Another man, a carpenter, stepped forward. "He cheated me on a job last winter, said I used bad wood, tried to get me to work for free." The floodgates had been opened. Story after story poured out. Tales of Henderson's cruelty, his greed, his manipulative ways. The townspeople, emboldened by Elias's quiet courage, found their own voices. They had suffered in silence for too long, afraid to speak out against a powerful man. But now, with a symbol of hope standing before them, they found the courage to tell their own stories. Henderson stood there, a ruined man, his face white with rage and fear. His power, once so great, had dissolved into nothing but the bitter residue of his own cruelty. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to control others. But he had not counted on a man who was not motivated by greed or power. He had not counted on a man who believed in a simple act of kindness and was willing to fight for it, not with his fists, but with the truth. Martha, standing on the edge of the crowd with Billy, watched it all unfold. She saw not a victory over an enemy, but the vindication of a simple act of compassion. She had been called a fool, a burden, a woman of no consequence. But here, in the middle of a dusty town, she had been proven right. Her kindness had been her strength. And it had brought her a man who was willing to fight for her, and in doing so had healed a town. The town meeting was more than just a confrontation. It was an exorcism. Thomas Henderson, who had spent a lifetime building his reputation on fear and intimidation, watched as it all crumbled to dust. He was no longer the powerful man of the town, but a common criminal, exposed in front of everyone he had ever wronged. The crowd, once so silent and submissive, now looked at him with a mixture of contempt and disgust. He tried to defend himself, his voice a frantic, desperate bluster. "It's a lie," he shouted, pointing a shaky finger at Elias Thorne. "He's making this up. He's trying to ruin me." But his words held no weight. The truth was out, and it was a torrent that had been building for years. "What about my land, Henderson?" a farmer cried out from the crowd. "The land you said you'd buy from me for a song. You told me it was worthless, but I saw you on it last week with your surveyors." "And my water rights?" another man shouted. "You stole my water rights after the last drought. I was a day from bankruptcy." "You told me it was an act of God." The accusations, once whispered in the dark corners of the saloon, were now shouted in the open. Henderson, in his blind rage, had not realized how many people he had wronged and how many of them were waiting for a chance to strike back. He was a vulture, and the townspeople, once his prey, had now become a united front against him. Elias Thorne stood in the center of it all, a silent, powerful force. He didn't have to say a word. He had given the townspeople their voice, and they were using it with a vengeance. He had not sought a fight, but he had entered one for the sake of a woman he barely knew, and in doing so had exposed a rot that had been festering in the town for years. Henderson, defeated, his face a mottled purple mask of rage, turned and stormed away. He mounted his horse, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He was a man who had lost everything, his reputation, his power, and his respect. He rode out of town, a solitary, humiliated figure, leaving behind a silence that was broken only by the sound of the wind. The town, for the first time in a long time, was at peace. A sense of relief and quiet triumph settled over the square. People began to turn to Martha. They approached her, their faces filled with a mixture of remorse and respect. "Mrs. Clarke," a woman said, her voice soft and apologetic. "I'm so sorry. We should have helped you. We should have believed you." "We were afraid," another man said, his voice filled with shame. "He had us all fooled. We didn't know what to do." Martha, who had been an outcast for so long, was now a symbol of their redemption. She was not a victim, but a hero. She had stood her ground, had refused to give in, and in her quiet strength she had inspired a man who had in turn given the town the courage to fight back. She looked at Elias Thorne, who was standing a few feet away, his expression calm and serene. He had done this for her. He had risked his own reputation, his own power to help her, and he had done so with a quiet dignity that was a lesson to them all. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the dusty land, Elias came to the cabin. He didn't speak of the meeting. He simply looked at Spirit, who was now grazing in the pasture, a picture of health and vitality. "He's a different horse now," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "He's a magnificent animal, and he's all yours." Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did this," she said. "You saved us all, not just me and Billy, but the whole town." Elias shook his head. "No," he said, his gaze steady. "You did. You had the courage to do what was right. I just gave you the chance to prove it. The rest, that was all you." He was a man who understood the value of a person's character. He knew that true strength came not from power or money, but from a good heart. And he had found that in a poor widow who had a foolish, beautiful dream of saving a horse. The town of Harmony Creek, once a place of bitter gossip and unspoken cruelty, was reborn in the wake of Thomas Henderson's humiliation. The air seemed cleaner, the sun a little brighter. The people, having found the courage to speak their truth, were now looking at each other not with suspicion, but with a newfound respect. A sense of community, lost for so long, was slowly returning. And at the heart of it all was Martha Clarke and her son Billy. They were no longer the poor widow and her crazy son. They were the heroes of the story, the quiet force that had brought about a powerful change. When Martha walked down the main street now, the stairs were no longer filled with pity or scorn, but with a mixture of awe and admiration. People offered her a kind word, a warm greeting, a helping hand. The butcher, old man Granger, gave her a prime cut of meat for free, a small token of his apology. The miller offered her a discount on her flour. The town had come together, and in doing so, had opened their hearts to the woman they had once shunned. Billy, for his part, was a different boy. He was confident and proud, his head held high. He walked with a new sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. He had seen his mother fight for what was right, and he had seen her win. He was no longer the boy who was afraid of what the town would say. He was the son of a brave woman, a woman who had taught him that a little kindness could change the world. The partnership with Elias Thorne had continued, but it had taken on a new, more personal dimension. He would come by the cabin not just to work with Spirit, but to sit with Martha and Billy on the porch, sharing a cup of coffee and a quiet conversation. He was a man who had built a life of wealth, but he had found his true home in the quiet companionship of a woman and her son. One afternoon, he came to the cabin with a new, beautiful saddle. "For you," he said to Martha, his voice low, "for when you're ready to ride. Spirit is a magnificent horse. He needs a partner as strong as he is." Martha's eyes welled with tears. The gesture was so kind, so thoughtful. It was not a grand gesture, but a personal one, a sign that he saw her not just as a business partner, but as an equal, a friend. "Thank you, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. The intimacy of it felt right, a natural progression of their bond. The final scene of the chapter takes place on a vast open field on Elias's ranch. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Spirit, now a picture of power and grace, is running freely, his movements fluid and beautiful. He is a king in his own domain, a living testament to the power of compassion. Martha and Elias stand side by side, watching him. Billy is riding beside him, a small, proud figure on a magnificent horse. Martha's heart is full. She had saved a dying animal, and in return, he had brought her a new life, a new home, and a new hope. She had a home, a son who was happy and strong, and a friend who had shown her the true meaning of kindness. "He's a magnificent creature," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "He is," Martha agreed. "He taught me that you can't judge a life by its outer shell. You have to look for the spirit within." Elias looked at her, and his eyes, so often unreadable, were filled with a profound sense of admiration. "You taught me that," he said. He didn't say anything more, but in his silence Martha understood. She had come to Harmony Creek a broken widow, and she had found her strength. She had fought for a horse, and in doing so had found her place in the world. And in the quiet, dusty expanse of the Old West, a new beginning had been born, one that was built not on greed or power, but on a simple, beautiful act of compassion. The victory over Thomas Henderson had brought a fragile peace to Harmony Creek. The air for the first time in memory felt lighter. The burden of his malice lifted from the town. Martha and Billy had settled into a comfortable routine, their lives now filled with the simple certainties of food on the table and a kind man's presence. Elias Thorne, for his part, had become an accepted, if still slightly mysterious, part of the community. His quiet strength and his unwavering loyalty had earned him a grudging respect from even the most cynical townsmen. The dust of the past seemed to have settled, but the peace was an illusion, a calm before a new, more insidious storm. This threat did not come in the form of a blustering bully, but in the polished guise of a man named Marcus Carlyle. He arrived in a clean, dust-free carriage, a stark contrast to the rugged ranch wagons of the area. He wore a crisp, tailored suit and a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was not a man of the land, but a man of the city, and he carried with him the scent of money and the cold, unyielding power of the law. Carlyle had been an associate of Thomas Henderson in a past, shady land deal, a connection that had soured when the deal went south. Now, having heard of Henderson's recent public downfall, he had come to Harmony Creek not to avenge his former associate, but to capitalize on the vacuum of power. He was a land speculator for a powerful, unseen corporation, a man who saw no beauty in the rolling hills and fertile soil, only dollar signs. He went to the town mayor first, then to the general store, not with threats, but with a quiet, polite inquiry. He asked about the property, about land deeds, about ownership. His questions were phrased with a veneer of professionalism, but his true purpose was unmistakable. He was digging, searching for a weakness, a forgotten claim, a legal loophole he could exploit. When Martha first heard of him, her heart sank. She had no more land to sell, no money to lose. But when Elias came to her a few days later, his face grim, she knew this was different. "There's a man in town, Martha," Elias said, "named Carlyle. He's been asking about your land, not about buying it, but about its legal history." A cold fear, unlike anything she had felt before, gripped her. This was not a bully she could defy. This was a man who spoke a language she didn't understand, the language of legal documents and courtrooms. Elias explained what he had learned. "He claims he has a deed to your land, a debt your husband owed him from a past business deal. He says your husband used your land as collateral and that the debt was never paid." Martha's mind reeled. "That's impossible," she said, her voice filled with a panicked disbelief. "My husband would never have done such a thing. He loved this land. It was our home." "I know," Elias said, his voice calm, "but he has a document. It looks official, a forged signature on a deed of trust. It's an old trick of the trade, a way to seize land without a single shot fired." The threat was no longer a physical one. It was a phantom, a legal document that could take everything she had fought for. The town, having just found its courage, was now unsure. They had rallied against a bully they knew, but this was a different game. Carlyle's smooth demeanor and his air of authority impressed them. He spoke of law and order, and some began to believe that Elias Thorne, for all his bravado, was just a simple rancher, no match for a city man with a legal claim. "He's a different kind of vulture, Martha," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Henderson used a shovel. Carlyle uses a pen. But the goal is the same." Martha felt a profound sense of helplessness. Her quiet courage, her physical strength, her deep-seated moral certainty, none of it mattered in the face of a forged document. She looked at Billy, playing innocently with spirit, and felt a wave of despair. The life she had so carefully rebuilt was on the verge of being ripped away once more. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias looked at her, his expression a mixture of deep concern and a quiet resolve she had come to know so well. "We fight him," he said, "but we don't fight him with muscle or public opinion. We fight him with his own weapons. We find the original deed. We find the truth. We prove his document is a fraud." The task seemed impossible. A search through forgotten legal records, a battle against a man who was an expert in his own field. Martha, in her simple life, had no idea how to even begin. But as she looked into Elias's eyes, she saw not just a rancher, but a man who had faced down powerful men before, a man who understood this world. She had trusted him before. She would trust him again. This was a new kind of war, a war for her land, her home and her future, and she would fight it with the only man she knew who had the weapons to win. The challenge posed by Carlyle was a different beast altogether. It was not a physical threat that could be met with fists or a show of force, but a mental one, a calculated move in a game of chess that Martha and Billy knew nothing about. The weight of this new burden fell heavily on Martha's shoulders. She had fought to save her horse, to protect her home, and she had won. But now she was faced with a threat she couldn't see, a threat that was hidden in the fine print of legal documents and the obscure language of the law. Elias Thorne, seeing her despair, came to her one evening, a quiet seriousness about him. He sat on her porch steps, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. He began to speak of his past, a part of his life he had never shared with her before. "I wasn't always a rancher, Martha," he said, his voice low. Before I came here, I was a land acquisition specialist. I worked for a large corporation. My job was to do exactly what Carlyle is trying to do now, to find old land deeds, legal loopholes, forgotten debts. I was good at it, ruthlessly good." Martha listened, a mixture of surprise and unease. The man she knew, the man of quiet dignity and respect for the land, seemed so different from the man he was describing. "We would buy up large tracts of land, using every legal trick in the book," he continued. "We would find people like you, people who didn't understand the law, and we would use our knowledge against them. We were the vultures of the city. We saw land not as a home, but as a commodity, a resource to be exploited. I made a lot of money. I had everything a man could want, but I had no soul." He paused, a flicker of pain in his eyes. "I quit. I walked away from it all. I bought a ranch, and I came here to build a new life, a life where the land was not something to be exploited, but something to be nurtured. I wanted to escape that life, Martha. I wanted to be a different kind of man." His confession was a raw, honest admission of his past sins. It was an act of profound trust, a way of showing her who he truly was. Martha, listening to him, felt a rush of understanding. He wasn't just a rich man who had come to Harmony Creek. He was a man who had been a predator and had chosen to become a protector. He had found his redemption in the simple life of a rancher and in her quiet courage. "Elias," she said, her voice soft, "your past. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with your knowledge now. You can use it for good. You can use it to fight a man who is using the same tricks you used to escape from. You can use it to protect us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new light. Her words had given him a new purpose, a new way of seeing his own past. He was no longer just running away from who he was. He was using his past to become a better man. Their partnership, which had started with a horse, was now an intellectual and emotional one. It was a partnership of minds, a shared mission to fight a new kind of darkness. "You're right," he said, a new resolve in his voice. "We'll fight him. We'll go to the county seat. We'll find the original land deeds. We'll find the truth. We'll prove that your husband would never have put your land in jeopardy. It won't be easy. It'll be a lot of work, but we'll do it together." And so began their new mission. Martha, with her simple, honest knowledge of her husband's character, and Elias with his profound understanding of the law and the dark secrets of his past profession. They would not fight with their fists, or with public opinion, or with gossip. They would fight with the truth, and with the kind of knowledge that Carlyle had always used as a weapon. They would use the very tools of the enemy to bring him down. The partnership, once a business arrangement, was now a beautiful, profound act of love and trust, a testament to the idea that a man's past does not define him, and that the greatest battles are often fought not with brute force, but with a quiet, powerful knowledge and a good heart. The journey to the county seat was a long and arduous one, a 2-day ride across a dusty, unforgiving landscape. They left Billy in the care of a trusted neighbor, a woman who had been one of the first to apologize to Martha after the town meeting. The quiet, unspoken bond between Martha and Elias grew stronger with every mile. They spoke of the land, of the weather, of their hopes and fears. They were no longer just a rancher and a widow, but two people on a shared mission, two souls who had found each other in the vast, lonely expanse of the Old West. When they arrived at the county seat, they were met with a bureaucracy that was as dusty and unyielding as the land itself. The land office was a small brick building, filled with shelves upon shelves of heavy, leather-bound books, their pages yellowed with age. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The clerk, a bespectacled man with a perpetually tired expression, looked at them with a weary skepticism. He had seen it all, the disputes over land, the feuds, the scams. He had no time for two people from a small town with a story about a forged deed. Elias, with his calm and authoritative demeanor, handled the negotiation. He spoke the language of the law, the language of land claims and property rights. He didn't ask for a favor. He simply stated his case with a clarity and a precision that impressed the jaded Clarke. He explained their situation, the threat of Carlyle, and the need to find the original deed to Martha's land. The clerk, convinced by Elias's obvious knowledge, finally agreed to help them. They spent the next few days in the land office, their fingers tracing the fine print of a century of land transactions. They pored over books, their eyes straining in the dim light. Martha, though she didn't understand the legal jargon, learned to follow the flow of information, the chain of ownership, the history of her small plot of land. She found herself seeing her home not just as a place, but as a living history, a piece of the world that had been fought for and protected by generations of people. Elias was a force of nature. He was in his element, his mind a labyrinth of legal knowledge and a detective's keen intuition. He would find a name, a date, a small detail, and then he would follow the thread, pulling on it until he found a new clue. He found that a previous owner of Martha's land had been a surveyor, and that the land had been surveyed twice, once in the early days of the town and once again years later, by a different surveyor. He found a detail in the second survey that was so small, so insignificant, that no one else would have noticed it. It was a note about a legal clause, a clause that stated that the land could not be used as collateral for a debt unless it was for the express purpose of improving the land. This small, crucial detail was their secret weapon. It was the key to unlocking the truth. But they needed more. They needed to find the original will of Martha's husband, John. They went to the probate office, another dusty, forgotten place, and found his will. It was a simple document, a testament to a simple man. But Elias found what he was looking for. A small handwritten note at the bottom, a note about a final debt, a debt that had been paid in full just before he died. It was a personal note, a note to his wife, telling her that he had cleared his last debt and that the land was theirs, free and clear. The proof was there, hidden in plain sight, a story of an honest man who had done the right thing. It was the final piece of the puzzle. They had the legal clause from the survey, and they had the personal note from the will. It was enough to prove Carlyle's deed was a fraud. They had found the truth, not in a grand, dramatic discovery, but in the quiet, painstaking work of a man who understood the language of the law and a woman who understood the language of her heart. They left the county seat, their hearts filled with a quiet triumph. They had not just found a legal defense. They had found a truth that was more powerful than any legal document. They had a story of a man's love for his family and his determination to leave them a legacy of honesty and honor. It was a story they would take back to Harmony Creek, a story that would expose Carlyle for the fraud he was, and would solidify their own bond, a bond that was now forged not just in a shared struggle, but in a shared victory. The return to Harmony Creek was a journey of quiet triumph. Martha and Elias were no longer just a rancher and a widow. They were a formidable team, a partnership forged in the fire of their shared struggle. Their bond was a silent, powerful force, a testament to the trust they had built and the obstacles they had overcome. When they rode into town, they were met with a sense of quiet anticipation. The townspeople had heard of their trip, and they were waiting, their expressions a mix of hope and trepidation. They knew that the fate of Martha's land, and perhaps their own, rested on the success of their mission. Elias, with his trademark calm, did not waste a moment. He arranged a meeting with Carlyle, the town mayor, and a few key community members. The meeting was held in the mayor's office, a small, dusty room that was the heart of the town's legal and political life. Carlyle, sleek and confident in his city clothes, looked at Martha and Elias with a smug, condescending smile. He had all the power, he thought. He had the law on his side, and they were just two people from a small town, no match for his intellect and his legal cunning. Elias began to speak, his voice a low, steady rumble. He did not accuse, he did not threaten. He simply laid out the evidence, calmly and methodically. He started with the forged deed, the one that Carlyle had presented as his claim to the land. He spoke of the paper, of the ink, of the fraudulent signature. He used legal terms that Carlyle understood, but that the townspeople found confusing. He was speaking a language of logic and evidence, a language that left no room for deceit. "Your claim, Mr. Carlyle," Elias said, "is based on a deed that is not a deed at all. It is a fraudulent document, a piece of paper meant to deceive. But you made a mistake. You did not check the original land survey, and you did not read the will of Mrs. Clarke's husband." Carlyle's smug smile faltered. He had not expected this. He had not expected to face a man who was an expert in his own field. He tried to interrupt, to bluster, to change the subject. But Elias, with a quiet authority, would not be swayed. He continued, laying out his case with a precise, unyielding logic. Then Martha, with a strength and a clarity she had never known, spoke. She didn't speak of legal documents. She spoke of her husband. She told the mayor and the community members about John's love for the land, about his dreams, about his honesty. She spoke of the handwritten note in his will, the one that had told her he had cleared his last debt. She was the human face of the legal battle, the heart of the story that Elias was telling. She gave the townspeople a reason to believe, a reason to care. Carlyle, seeing that he was losing, tried one last time to bluff his way out. He spoke of his powerful corporation, of the lawyers they had, of the money they could use to crush them. He tried to intimidate them, to remind them that this was a war they could not win, but it was too late. The townspeople had seen the truth. They had seen the look of fear on Carlyle's face. They had heard Elias's calm, logical presentation of the facts, and they had heard Martha's quiet, powerful story. They knew who to believe. The mayor, a man who had been a neutral party, now spoke, his voice filled with a quiet anger. "We don't do business with people who lie and cheat, Mr. Carlyle," he said, his gaze fixed on the land speculator. "This town has been through enough. We won't have it. We won't have you here. Your claim is a fraud, and you are a thief." Carlyle stood up, defeated. His sleek, polished armor had been pierced by a simple, powerful truth. He had come to Harmony Creek a conqueror, and he was leaving a humiliated, defeated man. He had underestimated the power of a small town and the strength of a woman who had found a man who would fight for her, not with brute force, but with a powerful, quiet knowledge and an unyielding belief in the truth. The mayor's declaration was the final nail in the coffin of Carlyle's plan. The room, once tense with uncertainty, now filled with a sense of relief and quiet triumph. The townspeople who had watched the unfolding drama with bated breath now turned to Carlyle, their faces a mixture of disgust and righteous anger. He had been exposed not just as a swindler, but as a man without a moral compass, a man who would use any means, no matter how despicable, to get what he wanted. Carlyle, seeing that he was completely outmatched, no longer had a shred of confidence left. He was a professional, and he knew when a deal was dead. He looked at Elias Thorne, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outfought by a man he had dismissed as a simple rancher. He had not counted on the fact that the man had been a predator himself, and knew all of his kind's tricks. He had come to the wrong town, and he had chosen the wrong prey. He stood up, his face a mask of furious resignation, and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He was a man who had lost everything: his claim, his reputation, and his victory. The town, for the first time in its history, was truly united. The fear and suspicion that had plagued it for so long were gone, replaced by a sense of collective purpose. They had seen a woman and a man fight for what was right, and they had stood with them. They were no longer a group of isolated, struggling individuals, but a community, a unified force for good. The mayor, a man who had learned a great deal in a very short time, looked at Martha and Elias with a sense of profound gratitude. "You saved us," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved us from ourselves. You showed us what it means to be a good neighbor, to stand up for what's right." Martha, who had been a symbol of the town's shame, was now a symbol of its redemption. She had come here broken, and she had found her strength in the most unlikely of places. She had fought for her home, and in doing so, had healed a town. That evening, the townspeople held a celebration. It was not a grand affair, but a simple gathering in the town square. There was music, food, and laughter. People talked to each other, not of gossip and rumor, but of hope and a new future. Martha and Billy were at the center of it all, a constant source of warmth and inspiration. People came to them, shaking their hands, offering them their thanks. They were no longer just the widow and her son. They were part of the community, part of the family. Elias Thorne stood in the shadows, a quiet, watchful presence. He was not a man for public fanfare. He had done what he needed to do, and he was content to stand on the sidelines and watch the result of his work. He had come to this town a man on a quest for his own redemption. He had found it, not in the solitude of his ranch, but in the shared struggle of a woman and her son. He had found his purpose in her quiet courage and in his own powerful knowledge. He walked to Martha, his presence a quiet comfort in the midst of the celebration. "It's over," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You won." Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and gratitude. "We won," she corrected him. "We won it together." He smiled, a rare, beautiful smile that reached his eyes. "Yes," he said, "we won it together." He had come to Harmony Creek a man who was running from his past. He had found a woman who was fighting for her future. He had used his dark knowledge for a good purpose, and in doing so had found his own redemption. He had found a new life, a new purpose, and a new hope. He had found a home, not in a piece of land, but in a woman's heart. The days that followed the town meeting were a gentle settling. The excitement had faded, but the change it had wrought was permanent. The town was no longer a place of fear and animosity, but a place of quiet camaraderie and newfound hope. The victory had been so complete, so profound, that it had left no room for bitterness or resentment. Thomas Henderson's land, which had been the source of so much pain, was now being put up for sale by a bank. A few of the local ranchers, now working together, were making plans to buy it, to divide it into smaller, manageable parcels, and to build a new life on the land that had once been a symbol of one man's greed. Martha's life, which had been so difficult and so lonely, was now filled with a quiet, certain joy. She had her home, her son, her horse, and her purpose. And she had Elias Thorne, He would come by the cabin every day, not just to work with Spirit, but to sit with her, to talk, to share a quiet meal. Their conversations had deepened, moving from the business of the ranch to the quiet, personal details of their lives. They had both suffered loss, they had both known a profound loneliness, and they had both found in the most unlikely of places a new chance at happiness. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in a blaze of colors, Elias came to the cabin. He was not on his horse. He was on foot, his presence a quiet, serious one. He sat on the porch step next to her, and the silence between them was a comfortable, powerful thing. "Martha," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "I came here to escape my past. I came here to build a new life, a simple life, a life where I could be a different man. I thought I had everything I wanted. I had the land, the horses, the quiet. But I was wrong." Martha looked at him, her heart pounding. She knew what he was about to say. She had seen it in his eyes, in his quiet gestures, in the way he looked at her and Billy. "When I met you," he continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "I found something I didn't know I was looking for. I found a purpose that was more important than any business deal. I found a reason to fight, not just for myself, but for you and for Billy. I found a home, Martha, and it's not a piece of land. It's here, with you and with your son." He turned to her, his stormy eyes filled with a raw, honest emotion. "I am not a man of grand gestures, Martha. I'm a simple man. I want to build a life with you. Not a life of wealth and power, but a life of quiet happiness, a life of family. I want to be a husband to you and a father to Billy. I want to be your partner, not just in business, but in life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple gold band. It was not a diamond ring. It was a simple, honest band, a symbol of a life that was built on truth and simplicity. "Will you marry me, Martha Clarke?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet, profound hope. Martha's eyes welled with tears. This was not a proposal of a man who was offering her a future. This was a man who was asking her to build a future with him. This was a man who had been a loner, and who had found his home in her. She had been a widow, and she had found her future in a man who had fought for her, not with fists, but with his heart and his mind. She reached out her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and took his. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice a whisper filled with emotion. "Yes, I will." He put the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit, a beautiful, simple symbol of a new beginning, a new life, a new family. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped together, the silent, beautiful promise of a future stretching out before them. They had both lost so much. They had both known such pain. But now, in the quiet, dusty expanse of the Old West, they had found their redemption, their purpose, and their love. The wedding was a small, simple affair. The entire town of Harmony Creek turned out. They came not just as guests, but as a family. They had been a part of Martha's struggle, and they were now a part of her triumph. They had been a witness to her fight, and they were now a witness to her happiness. The mayor, a man who had become a friend, officiated the ceremony. He spoke of love, of resilience, and of the power of a single, simple act of kindness. He spoke of a woman who had saved a dying animal, and in doing so, had found her own salvation. He spoke of a man who had used his past to build a better future, and in doing so had found his purpose. Martha, dressed in a simple, beautiful white dress, walked down the dusty aisle, her hand in Elias's. Billy, a proud smile on his face, stood by their side. He was no longer an orphan in a world of hardship. He was a son, a part of a family that was built not on blood, but on a shared love and a shared journey. The days that followed were a blur of happiness. Martha and Elias began to build their life together. He sold his large ranch and bought a new, larger piece of land that adjoined Martha's small cabin. They would build a new, larger ranch house, a home that would be a testament to their new life. Spirit, the horse that had been the catalyst for it all, was not sold. He was a part of their family, a living, breathing symbol of their journey. He was the first horse on their new combined ranch, and he would be there to watch over them, a constant reminder of the day a poor widow chose to save a dying animal, and in doing so, had saved her own life. Billy, under Elias's patient guidance, was becoming a young man. He learned to ride, to rope, to work the land. He learned to be a good man, a man of honor and purpose. He had a father, a man who loved him and taught him, a man who would be there for him, no matter what. He had a new life, a new family, a new future. The final scene of the story takes place on a hill overlooking their new land. The sun is setting, casting a warm, golden light over the rolling hills. Martha, Elias, and Billy stand side by side, their hands clasped together. They are a family, a picture of quiet, simple happiness. They have a home, a future, and a love that was built on the foundation of a simple act of compassion. Martha looks at Elias, her heart filled with a profound sense of gratitude. "I never thought I would have a life like this again," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I thought I had lost everything." Elias looked at her, his eyes a warm, beautiful light in the fading sun. "You didn't lose anything, Martha," he said, his voice a low, loving rumble. "You just had to lose your old life to find your new one, and you had to find a dying horse to find your true home." He put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They stood there, their gaze fixed on the horizon, on the promise of a new day. They had a home, a family, and a love that was built on a simple, profound truth, that a kind heart is a compass that can lead you to the most beautiful and unexpected of places. They had found their way, not with wealth or power, but with a single, simple act of compassion and a belief in the power of the human spirit. Their lives, once so lonely and so filled with pain, were now filled with a quiet, beautiful, and lasting peace.